My name is Evelyn Marlowe. I'm 65 years old, and until this morning I thought I knew my daughter. I was sitting in the doctor's waiting room, flipping through an old Coastal Living magazine when my phone rang. The name on the screen, Leela, brought a small, foolish smile to my face. My only child, my reason for breathing since the day I buried her father. "Hey, sweetheart," I answered. Her tone was clipped, mechanical. "Mom, I don't have much time, but I wanted to call before you hear it from someone else," she said. "Edward and I are moving to California tomorrow. I sold the bookstore. It's done." For a moment, I thought she was joking. The words didn't make sense. The bookstore, the Marlowe bookshop, wasn't just a business. It was my husband's heartbeat carved into brick and wood. Tom and I bought that place 40 years ago when it was falling apart, and we spent every weekend sanding, painting, scraping. It was where we raised our daughter, where she learned to read, to dream, to fall asleep behind the counter with storybooks as blankets. And now, in a sterile waiting room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my daughter told me she had sold it, without asking, without warning, without shame. "You what?" My voice cracked. "It's been struggling for years, Mom," she said, her tone light, as if we were talking about a piece of furniture. "Edward found a buyer, a developer from Boston who's going to turn it into a cafe/gallery. It's time to move forward. You've worked long enough, you'll thank me later." My fingers went cold. "You sold it without asking me? Technically, you gave me the papers to handle Dad's estate, remember? That power of attorney still stands." I felt the air drain from the room. Power of attorney. The documents she'd placed in front of me months after Tom died, when I was too broken to read anything, just signing where she told me. "It's just to help with taxes," she'd said. And now that trust had become a weapon. "Mom," she continued, "you should rest. The bookstore was too much. We deposited some money into your account, enough to cover you for a while. Once we get settled in California, maybe you can come visit. Okay, I'll call you later." The line went dead. I sat there staring at my reflection in the clinic's glass door. Behind me, someone coughed, a child laughed, and somewhere a nurse called another name. The world went on. Mine stopped. 40 years of love, of dusting shelves, of saving a dream that barely made enough to pay the bills. 40 years of watching my husband die slowly behind that counter, smiling every time a kid bought his first book. Gone, just like that. I didn't cry. Something colder settled inside me, a stillness I hadn't felt since Tom's funeral. "Tom," I could almost hear his voice. "Evie, breathe, you're stronger than you think." And then I remembered. A month before he died, Tom had given me an envelope. "Put this somewhere safe," he'd said. "If something happens to me, open it when you're ready." I hadn't been ready, not until now. When I got home, I went straight to our bedroom above the shop, the same room I'd painted butter yellow after Leela was born. The air still smelled faintly of ink and paper. The shelves were half empty now, waiting for the new owner's contractors. The place felt like a ghost. I opened the dresser drawer, and there it was, the manila envelope, thick and heavy. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside were legal documents, bank statements, and one folded letter. The handwriting stopped my breath. "My Evie, if you're reading this, I've gone where even you can't follow for a while. I didn't tell you everything because I didn't want to burden you with worry. Over the years, I bought the building, not just the bookstore, but the whole block. I invested in the marina and a few rental spaces around town under a trust called Harborlight Holdings. Everything is in your name. Leela doesn't know. Please keep it that way. You've worked too hard to lose what we built. If anything happens, call Margaret Duval. You remember Maggie from high school? She's a lawyer now. She'll know what to do. You were always my safe harbor, Evie. Don't let anyone sell your sea." Tom, I sat there, clutching the letter, my throat tight. Tom, my steady, secretive, impossible man. While I'd been counting coins to fix a leaking roof, he'd been building an empire in silence. I could almost see his sly little smile when I'd ask, "Did you put something away for emergencies?" And he'd wink and say, "Maybe." The papers confirmed everything. I wasn't just the owner of the bookstore. I owned the entire building, the bakery next door, the antique shop, and even the apartments above them. My daughter hadn't just sold my store. She'd tried to sell what didn't belong to her. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter. The world outside was dark, the street quiet except for the hum of the harbor cranes in the distance. I should have been shaking, but instead I felt calm, dangerously calm. I made tea. I opened my notebook and I began to plan. The next morning I called Maggie. "Evie Marlowe," she said, her voice warm and surprised. "It's been ages." "Tom left me something," I said. "I need your help." 2 hours later, I was sitting in her office downtown. Maggie had the same sharp green eyes she'd had in high school, the kind that saw through pretenses. She read Tom's documents in silence. Then she looked up at me, lips parted. "Evelyn, you're the sole trustee of Harborlight Holdings. This isn't small, you own half the waterfront." The words hit me like a wave. "And Leela?" She had no authority to sell the property. The power of attorney only covered Tom's personal estate, not the trust. What she did is legally invalid and criminal if she forged your consent. I let out a shaky breath. "Can we fix it?" "Yes," Maggie said, quietly. "We can freeze the sale and reverse it. The buyer will get their money back, but the property will return to you." "Do it," I said. Maggie studied me for a long moment. "Evie, I have to ask, do you want to press charges?" I thought of Leela, the little girl who used to curl up beside me in the shop, tracing the spines of storybooks. The teenager who'd cried when her father went into surgery. The woman who had just sold my life over the phone. "No," I said, "not yet." Maggie nodded slowly. "Then we'll keep it quiet." When I left her office, the November air was cold and briny, and the gulls screamed overhead. The world looked sharper, clearer. For the first time in months, I felt like myself. Days passed, and the town whispered. News travels fast in a place where everyone knows the color of your curtains. "Did you hear?" Aurora asked me at the farmer's market. "Your daughter sold the bookstore. I can't imagine after all those years." I smiled faintly. "She thinks she did," I said. Aurora frowned. "What do you mean?" "Just that some things can't be sold," I replied and walked away. That night, I found myself in the empty shop. I turned on the single lamp near the register and let its warm circle of light fall on the worn oak counter where Tom's hands had rested so many times. I could still feel him there. "I'm going to fix this," I whispered into the still air. "I promise you," and I meant it. Because while my daughter thought she had taken everything, she'd only shown me something I'd forgotten. That quiet doesn't mean weakness, and loss doesn't mean the end. I folded Tom's letter, placed it in my coat pocket, and locked the shop behind me. The tide was low. The smell of salt and old wood filled the street. I could hear the sea breathing, slow and eternal, as if it knew something I didn't. And as I stood there, watching the moonlight spill over the harbor, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of hers. When Maggie said we could freeze the sale, the relief that rose in me felt like a tide turning, slow at first, then insistent. It didn't look heroic. It looked like a woman in sensible shoes opening a legal form and learning how to use a pen like an instrument of reclamation. It felt oddly like love. Maggie and I met twice a week for a while. Her office smelled faintly of lemon and paperbacks. She kept a sagging copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on the windowsill. She moved with the tidy efficiency of someone who had argued in courtrooms and at PTA meetings, someone who had learned the value of being precise. "First," she said the day we signed the injunction papers, "we secure Harborlight Holdings. You are its trustee. That means the trust's assets are under your control unless you have legally transferred them. We file an emergency motion to suspend any transfers tied to the bookstore building, the adjacent storefronts, and the marina shares. We notify the buyer that the transaction is subject to review." "Will it be messy?" I asked, feeling for the first time the small, sharp prick of fear that comes with making a big move. "Possibly, but we'll manage it. Quietly, if you want." I did want quiet. I wanted the work to feel like a mending of a seam, not like ripping fabric in public. Leela had done a loud thing. I preferred the steady, measured kind of justice that let the person wronged keep her dignity intact while the truth is set right. We filed the motion the following day. Maggie typed with a certain old-school flourish. She'd once taught typing to the high school seniors, and then she called the escrow company and the buyer's attorney. There were placating words, some confusion, and then the polite surrender that happens when people discover they bought what someone else really owns. The buyer asked for a refund. The escrow company agreed. No one wanted a messy courtroom in a sleepy harbor town over a modest storefront. Meanwhile, Maggie had a look at the power of attorney forms Leela had used. My throat had tightened when I'd handed them over, the way a person does when offering something that might be used against them. Maggie frowned as she read. "This is odd," she said. "The language is broad and the notarization is sloppy. It's not typical of a document someone would hand a grieving person to sign. There's a chance Leela acted on misrepresentation. There's also a chance," she hesitated, then spoke the word I had feared. "Forgery." That taste of betrayal I'd swallowed when Leela's voice had spoken across the clinic phone came back, a sour note that made me want to retch. But Maggie was steady. "We'll do a handwriting analysis if we need to," she said. "And if Edward is connected, if he has been using the trust's assets as leverage, then we'll find it. We'll thread the needle." Legal work is a strange kind of craft. It requires patience and stubbornness, but also imagination. I began to learn its grammar, affidavits, sworn statements, disclosure forms. I learned how to read a ledger with something like reverence. Each entry told a small secret: a wire here, a cashier's check there, a transfer to an unknown account. It felt like reading a map where the places of the heart had been turned into coordinates. While Maggie did her quiet unraveling, I did the other work. The shop, for all the contractor's graffiti and the stripped shelves, was still mine to walk through. I started going there in the mornings before the sun rose, the lights soft and quiet. I swept the floorboards, the motion meditative, like clearing away grief. I restocked a few beloved titles from my own collection, the spines a private comfort. People stopped by sometimes, old customers who remembered the bookstore when it smelled of popcorn and Saturday story time. "Evelyn," said Mrs. Harker from the bakery one morning when I'd put a small stack of poetry on the counter, "we're so glad you're taking care of things." Leela called me while she was packing, said she thought it was time for new management. I told her she'd always be welcome back here. I thanked her, and the way the words landed in my chest almost felt like balm. I wanted to tell the world that the shop wasn't for sale, that the stacks and the posters and the crooked sign above the door were not a commodity. They were a memory palace. None of this stopped the world from whispering. The local cafe had a new mural and a new owner. The antique shop's windows were dark for a week. The marina had flyers about seasonal slips. People accepted change as if it were weather. Then, from California, came a call that rang through the calm I'd constructed. Leela's voice on the phone was thinner than I expected, frayed at the edges. "Mom," she said, and there was a patch of pleading in it that I hadn't heard in months. "We've had a problem. Edward, he lied. There's no investment. He took the money for supplies and disappeared. I've been living on credit. The developer's lawyers are asking questions. I think they're going to take everything." All my training and patience failed in that instant. My hands shook. I had wanted Leela to learn to value what she'd thrown away. I had not wanted to watch her crash so fast and hard. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice calm because that is what people do when they are made of the small courages. "He promised a loan, he promised clients," she said. "Then nothing. I thought I could keep it afloat until he came through. I didn't know he had taken loans out in my name. They're calling me about defaulting. I can't, Mom, I can't breathe here. I'm coming home." 100 practical responses fluttered and fell. "Do not let her come home yet. Don't give in. Make her stay." But the sound of her fear, of the woman who had once been a child under our table, reached somewhere I could not refuse. "You can come," I said softly. "Come home. I'll meet you at the shop. Don't tell anyone yet." When she arrived a week later, she was smaller than I remembered, her shoulders drawn inward like someone carrying a heavy, secret weight. She had one battered suitcase and an old leather jacket Tom used to joke about when she was 16. Her hair was shorter, uncertain. For a moment, we simply stood in the doorway, the store's old bell jingling, a small, familiar sound that was like a key. People outside paused to look, the way neighborhoods do when they witness the slow unspooling of a family drama. "Mom," she said, And then she hugged me with a desperation that made me feel like both rescuer and executioner. I hugged her back because she was my daughter and because even when someone hurts you, their pain can still be a plea. We sat at the kitchen table in the flat above the shop, our old table, scarred and dark, and she told me everything. Edward's charm, his invented partners, the promises he made about venture capital and supply lines. The way he'd press his forehead against hers and say, "Trust me," she had trusted him. She had signed things she didn't read. Later, she had called me with the cool, practical voice she used on the phone at the clinic, and she had said the bookstore had to go. Now she was here, and the bookstore's empty shelves looked like an accusation. "I'm sorry," she said, the words small and raw. "I didn't know." "I know," I said, "but we have to be honest about what happened. There are people who might be hurt if this goes wrong. We need to be careful. And we need to tell the truth where it matters." Over the next days, the town watched a slow thing. My daughter, humbled, working the counter and answering questions about orders and donations. She swept floors, shelved paperback romances she'd once scoffed at, and accepted the small hum of the register as penance. She made coffee for the local men who came in early and listened to their stories. She smiled a lot, but less like the woman who used to laugh at luxury brunches and more like a person learning the grammar of another life. Inside, the legal work continued. Maggie discovered that Edward had been trying to leverage one of the apartment units as collateral on a business loan without the trustees' approval. There were attempts to claim rental income as his own. Some of the bank records led to shadow accounts in a state halfway across the country. Maggie's calls to those banks were careful, precise. A letter arrived telling us that claims would be frozen pending investigation. "It's messy," she told me, "but not fatal." There were late nights when Leela and I sat at the back table cataloging return donations, and she would rest her head in her hands and say, "I don't deserve you." "You do," I would reply and mean it. "You just need to learn to be someone who recognizes what she nearly lost." She started to cry less often. She started to ask questions. She started to read the little notices Maggie left for her on the counter. "Don't sign anything. Call me." She took out old ledgers and matched them to electronic transfers, learning numbers the way a poetry student learns lines. She became, slowly, a person who could be trusted with small things. And yet, not everything was small. One afternoon, as the August sun turned the harbor into a sheet of mercury, a call came from California that stopped my breath. "Is this Evelyn Marlowe?" a man's voice asked. He identified himself as a claims investigator for a bank. The words tumbled. "There are outstanding debts, there are liens, there are inquiries into Edward's use of company funds." He asked if I was aware of transfers made on behalf of Harborlight Holdings. My stomach dropped like a stone. I had thought we were closing off every way in. I had not expected the repercussions would reach so far. "Not yet," I said, feeling the weight of the trust in my lap like a ledger. "But we're working on it." He paused. "We'll be in touch." After I hung up, I went to the register and put my hands on the worn wood. The shop smelled like old paper and lemon oil. Leela stood behind the counter, listening with a pale face. "I didn't know," she said, and there was a remorse so deep it looked like water over stone. "I know," I said again. "We will fix it, but we have to be careful. We have to let the law do its work." I thought of Tom's letter in my coat pocket and the quiet intelligence of a man who had built a harbor of protection for us with slow hands. I thought of how terribly vulnerable he had left us and how terribly brave he had been. The town was changing around us. People took sides silently, some angry that Leela had sold what she shouldn't have, others sympathetic because she had come home, battered and contrite. I kept my face calm and my work steady, legal documents by day, cataloging and coffee by morning, patience like a stitch in the night. There is a particular ache in watching your child stumble and wanting to be both parent and teacher. I had meant in my quiet way to let Leela learn the cost of selfishness. I had not wanted her to be devoured by it. The world, it seemed, had a taste for both mercy and reckoning. That night, as the gulls argued over the docks and the lighthouse blinked its slow Morse out to sea, the shop's phone rang. Leela picked it up with a hands-dry, steady voice. "Hello," she said. She listened. Her face went pale. She turned to me and held up the receiver like a small, white flag. "It's him," she whispered. Her voice was barely more than a breath. "Edward, the man I loved, he's on the news. They arrested him in San Diego. Fraud. They say he used multiple identities." My chest did the odd, lurching thing it had not done since Tom's funeral, that whiplash between relief and something else, anger, pity, vindication, grief. Leela's shoulders shook. I went to her, wrapped my arms around her, and felt her trembling against me like a sheet in a storm. "Maybe this will clear things up," I said, and I didn't know whether I was talking to her or to myself. "Maybe now we can show the townsfolk what you didn't know. Maybe now you can learn without losing everything." She nodded into my shoulder, and for a moment I let myself believe it. For a moment I let myself imagine the long arc I was trying to draw, that justice could be quiet and fair, that a daughter could learn humility without being erased, that a life could be rebuilt like a bookshop restored. Outside, the harbor waters clicked against the pilings. The lighthouse's beams swept across the glass, and the bell of the old church began its slow, evening toll. There would be hearings. There would be bank investigators and paperwork and the kind of public hurt that doesn't heal quickly. But there was also now something else, a crack through which truth could shine. I put my hand on the counter where Tom's elbow used to rest and closed my eyes. Tom had left me more than property. He had left me the chance to be a steward of that hard, gentle legacy. I breathed in the smell of paper and salt and the faint lemon oil that clung to Maggie's briefcase, and I tried to anchor myself to what I truly wanted: to teach, to protect, to forgive but not without truth, to hold my daughter's hand while she relearned the language of responsibility. The shop's bell jingled as someone came in, an old man with a dog carrying a book in his hand. Life, noticeably stubborn, continued. And then, as the bell clicked again, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The screen read, "Unknown number, California Newslink." I tapped it open because I always did, because I am a woman who believes in facing things rather than pretending they don't exist. The headline scrolled up in stark, modern type. "Local developer arrested in San Diego on fraud charges, links to Harborlight Holdings under investigation." I let the phone slip from my hand and watch it land on the counter like a coin. Leela looked at me wide-eyed. "Mom, I think," I said slowly, "our lessons are only just beginning." She sat down hard and her hands covered her face. I folded my own hands, knuckles smooth against each other, and felt the old, quiet resolve settle like bread at the center of me. We had the law, we had the truth, we had each other, messy, stubborn, capable of great harm and greater repair. Outside, the tide rose, the lighthouse blinked. The town held its breath, and so did I. When the news of Edward's arrest broke, our little harbor town behaved the way small towns always do when scandal sails in on the morning tide. It whispered first, then judged, then pretended it had always known. By breakfast, the bakery line was buzzing. By noon, Aurora stopped pretending to buy muffins just to tell me she'd heard about the California thing. By evening, strangers were knocking gently on the bookstore door, leaving flowers or cards that said things like "thinking of you" or "glad justice found its way home." Justice? People use that word so easily, as if it's a coat you can just put on. But to me, justice felt heavier, more like a quilt stitched from truth, pain, and a kind of love that doesn't let you off the hook. Because even though Edward was the one behind bars, it was my daughter's name that people whispered through their coffee steam. Leela didn't leave the apartment above the shop for 3 days. She barely ate. She barely slept. She'd sit by the window, staring at the harbor, her reflection wavering in the glass like she didn't recognize the woman staring back. The guilt in her eyes was the kind that doesn't need words. On the 4th morning, I brought her a mug of tea and set it beside her. "The paper says they might call you to testify," I said softly. She nodded without looking away from the water. "They think I knew," she whispered. "They think I helped him? Do you?" Her head jerked up, eyes wide. "No, Mom, I swear, I know," I interrupted, my voice gentle. "I had to ask, it's what the world will ask. But I believe you." The relief in her face cracked something inside me. "Why didn't you tell me how bad it was?" I asked. She swallowed hard. "Because I was ashamed. You and Dad, you worked your whole lives to build something real. And she broke off, shaking her head. I thought I was smarter. I thought I could do more than books and dust and cups of coffee for tourists. I wanted a bigger life. And you thought selling your father's dream would get you there." She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I was wrong." I sat beside her, watching gulls dive into the gray-green waves. "Maybe," I said, "but you're not finished yet. We still have work to do." The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of slow repair. Maggie came by almost daily, her leather briefcase always full of new papers and cautious optimism. "Edward's assets are frozen," she said one morning, sliding a document toward me. "The court's recognizing Harborlight Holdings as separate from his dealings. You're protected." Protected. It was a strange word, part shield, part cell. I'd never been a woman who wanted power. I wanted peace. But now that power was mine, whether I liked it or not. The buildings, the bookstore, the marina shares. People who had once waved politely in passing now stopped me on the street to ask if I was planning to sell, as if the harbor itself were waiting for my permission to breathe. I told them the same thing every time. "No, I'm planning to restore." And I meant it. I wanted to breathe life back into the bookstore, to bring the shelves and coffee counter and reading nook back from memory, not as revenge, as rebirth. I hired a few young people from town, painted the walls myself, scrubbed the floors until the smell of lemon oil replaced the stale scent of dust and lawyers. I replaced the cracked sign with one that read, "Marlowebooks, Est. 1982 and still here." The first day we reopened, the shop smelled of new paper and rain. The bell jingled again for the first time in months, and it sounded like forgiveness. Leela worked beside me. She insisted on it. She helped arrange the displays, her movements tentative but purposeful, like someone learning a language she used to know. When she handed a customer a receipt and smiled, I saw flickers of the child she used to be, curious, bright, so full of light. People accepted her kindness awkwardly at first, but time has a way of softening edges. One afternoon, old Mrs. Harker came in and said, "I suppose we all make foolish choices when we're following the wrong person, dear." Leela looked startled, then whispered, "Thank you." That night after we closed, she said to me, "I didn't think anyone would ever forgive me." I looked at her. "Forgiveness isn't a switch, Leela, it's a tide. You don't control it, you just learn when to stand still and let it wash over you." She nodded slowly, as if testing the truth of that sentence in her bones. But peace is never permanent, not when money and memory are involved. One afternoon, Maggie arrived at the shop, face grave. She set a thin folder on the counter. "Evie, we've got a complication." I wiped my hands on a rag and opened the folder. A copy of a court notice stared back at me, notice of hearing, State of California versus Edward Kincaid with related parties. My stomach tightened. Related parties? "Leela's name appears on some of the joint filings," Maggie said quietly. She didn't know Edward used her digital signature on a few investment forms. Nothing catastrophic, but she'll need to appear in court. It's the only way to clear her record. I felt the air leave my lungs. "California," I whispered. "We can't afford—" "I'll cover it," Maggie interrupted gently. "You'll both stay with my sister in Monterey, quiet place. No press, I'll arrange the paperwork. But Evelyn," she hesitated, "you'll need to be strong for her. They'll question everything, even her ignorance." I nodded, the weight of old motherhood settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar coat. "When do we leave?" "Monday." I hadn't been on a plane in 20 years. The hum of the engines, the way the clouds looked like torn cotton beneath us, it all made me feel strangely small and strangely brave. Leela sat beside me, silent for most of the flight. Halfway through, she reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. "I don't deserve this," she said quietly. "Maybe not," I replied. "But you're here, that counts for something." When we landed in California, the world smelled different, citrus and salt instead of pine and fog. Maggie's sister, Jo, met us at the gate, all warmth and kindness. She took us to a small cottage overlooking the ocean. "Stay as long as you need," she said. The next morning, we dressed in our best clothes and walked into the courthouse together. The hearing was quiet but brutal. The prosecutor's voice was measured, clinical, but each question felt like a blade. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, "did you knowingly authorize your husband's transactions through Harbor Light Holdings?" "No," Leela said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know," he leaned forward. "So you admit negligence?" She flinched. "I admit I trusted the wrong person." There was a long silence, the kind that stretches heavy and dangerous. Then the judge spoke, a middle-aged woman with eyes that had seen too many stories like ours. "Mrs. Kincaid," she said softly, "you made mistakes, but you've cooperated fully. The court sees no grounds for criminal charges. However, financial restitution will be required for the misused funds." Leela nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I wanted to reach for her hand, but I stayed still. This was her moment, her reckoning. And sometimes a mother's love means letting her child stand alone before the storm. When the hearing ended, she turned to me. "I'm free," she whispered. "Yes," I said, "but freedom isn't the same as peace. That will take time." We stayed in Monterey for another week. Leela walked the beach every morning, picking up shells and stacking them in little towers. She said the waves made her feel like she could start over. I believed her. One evening, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "I sold my jewelry," she said. "It's not much, but it's a start. I want to pay back the people we hurt. And I want to help rebuild the bookstore properly this time." I stared at her, the sunset painting her face gold and red. "You don't owe me money, Leela." "It's not for you," she said. "It's for Dad." And that broke me a little. Because in that moment, I saw not the woman who betrayed me, but the girl Tom and I had raised, the one who used to write poems about the ocean and tape them to the shop window. We flew home the next day. The harbor looked the same, calm, gray, eternal, but something in us had shifted. The shop reopened quietly. People came, they smiled, they bought books again. And one evening, as I was closing the register, I noticed Leela standing by the window, watching the sea. "Mom," she said softly, "do you ever think Dad planned this, all of it? The trust, the envelope, even me learning the hard way?" I smiled faintly. "Tom believed in letting life teach what love can't. Maybe he knew we'd need to fall apart to find each other again." She nodded slowly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I just hope I can be the kind of person he believed I could be." "You already are," I whispered. The light from the harbor poured through the glass, warm and golden. The bell over the door jingled one last time for the night. And as we stood there side by side, surrounded by books and salt and forgiveness, I realized that sometimes justice doesn't come with punishment. Sometimes it comes with understanding. And sometimes that's enough to save you. It was early spring when the stranger came into my bookstore. The air still carried winter's bite, but sunlight had begun sneaking between the clouds, warming the dust motes that danced above the counter. I was restocking the poetry shelf, Tom's favorite corner, when the bell jingled. The man who stepped through the door didn't look like the usual kind of visitor we got. He wasn't a tourist or one of the locals who came for coffee and gossip. He had that calm, deliberate stillness of someone who watches more than he speaks. Gray coat, leather gloves, clean-shaven. A face you'd forget if not for the eyes, cold, calculating, and far too familiar. "Mrs. Marlowe?" he asked. Something in his voice made my pulse skip. It wasn't threatening, just too certain. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone even. "Can I help you?" He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "My name is Daniel Reed. I worked with your husband." My first instinct was disbelief. Tom had been a teacher for most of his life before he bought the shop. The idea that this man, this polished, sharp-edged stranger, had been part of Tom's quiet world felt absurd. "I'm sorry," I said. "You must be mistaken." "No," he replied calmly. "I knew him well. We were partners before he started Harbor Light Holdings." Partners? The word hit like a cold wind through an open window. I gestured for him to sit. He did, removing his gloves with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who enjoys control. "Tom never mentioned you," I said. He smiled again, faintly. "He wouldn't have. We didn't part on good terms." Something about the way he said it made the hairs on my arms rise. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed documents, contracts dated years ago. I caught the name at the top, Harbor Light Development Partnership. Tom's signature was there, so was Daniel's. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Your husband and I started Harbor Light together, he said. We had plans for this town, projects, restorations, community spaces. But when money started coming in, he bought me out. Quietly, legally. Ruthlessly. My voice came out low, wary. Tom wasn't ruthless. Daniel's eyes softened, almost pitying. Mrs. Marlowe, people are rarely who we think they are. He leaned forward. He built this empire on my blueprints. And when I came back from overseas, he'd erased me, left me nothing but debts. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of the counter. Why are you here now? He looked at me for a long time before answering. Because your husband's death doesn't erase what I'm owed. Harbor Light Holdings belongs partly to me. You're in possession of assets that are legally disputed. I swallowed hard. You can take it up with my lawyer. He nodded as if he'd expected that. Oh, I intend to, but I wanted to come in person first, call it courtesy. There was something unnerving about his calmness. His eyes weren't angry. They were patient, like a man who knows he's already set something in motion. After he left, the shop felt different. The sunlight seemed colder, the air heavier. I stood there for a long time, staring at the folder he'd left on the counter. Inside, the signatures were real, Tom's handwriting unmistakable. There was no denying it. That night I called Maggie. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the concern underneath. Send me copies, she said. Don't panic. These old partnerships can be complicated. If Tom paid him out properly, we'll find the paperwork. Leela overheard the conversation and came into the kitchen, worry etched across her face. Who was that man? Someone from your father's past, I said. Is it bad? I hesitated. It's unfinished. Maggie came over the next morning, spread the papers across the kitchen table, and began flipping through them. These are legitimate documents, she said slowly. But they're ancient, almost 30 years old. If Tom bought him out, there has to be a record of the transfer. It might not be under Harbor Light Holdings, it could be part of another entity he used before he created the trust. We searched everywhere. File cabinets, old boxes in the attic, the safe in the closet that still smelled faintly of Tom's cologne. Nothing. And yet something about Daniel's story didn't sit right with me. Tom wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a man who erased people. He believed in fairness, in integrity. If he'd bought this man out, he would have done it cleanly. I just had to find the proof. That night I went down to the bookstore again. The shop was dark except for the small lamp by the counter. I unlocked the back room, Tom's old office, untouched since his death. I opened drawer after drawer, searching through old ledgers, receipts, tax forms. The air smelled of dust and ink and salt. And then in the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of yellowing invoices, I found a small, sealed envelope with my name on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a flash drive. The note read, Evie, if you're reading this, someone came looking for what they think is theirs. There's a man named Daniel Reed. He may tell you I stole from him. The truth is more complicated. We started Harbor Light together, yes, but he began laundering funds through our accounts. When I confronted him, he vanished. I covered the losses myself and dissolved the partnership quietly to protect you and Leela. The records are on this drive. Don't trust him. He's patient but not honest. You always said the past has a way of washing up when the tide turns. If it has, stay calm. Maggie knows who to call. All my love, Tom. My knees nearly gave out. Tom had known. All those years ago, he'd already seen this man coming back. I sank to the floor, clutching the letter to my chest, tears finally spilling down my face. After all this time, even from the grave, Tom was still protecting us. Maggie came the next morning, read the letter, and nodded grimly. We can use this. It's a direct statement of prior fraud. We'll file a notice of dispute. If Reed pushes this, we'll counterclaim with intent to extort. And that's exactly what we did. But Daniel wasn't going quietly. Within a week, a formal complaint arrived, Reed versus Marlowe Estate. He was demanding half of Harborlight's assets, claiming unlawful termination of partnership and concealment of shared property. It was the kind of thing that could drag on for years. Leela was furious. "He's lying," she shouted one night as we pored over the papers. "How can he even do this?" "Because men like him thrive on chaos," Maggie said. "He's not after justice, he's after leverage. He's hoping you'll give in to make it stop." I looked at Leela then, her jaw set, her eyes hard. She was changing. The woman who once ran from her mistakes now stood beside me, shoulders squared, ready to fight. "Then we won't give him what he wants," she said. "Not this time." Weeks turned into months. The legal battle began: letters, hearings, depositions. Daniel's lawyers were relentless, sending demands for records, tax statements, anything they could weaponize. But Maggie was better. Every time a new document came in, she'd smile that quiet, deadly smile and say, "He's bluffing." I learned things about Tom I'd never known, the way he'd built Harborlight not just as an investment but as a safety net for our town. He'd used profits to fund scholarships, repair the church roof, pay hospital bills for workers at the docks. He hadn't built an empire for himself, he'd built one for all of us. And suddenly, Daniel's greed wasn't just a legal problem, it was personal. He wasn't trying to steal from me, he was trying to unravel everything Tom had built, everything our family, our town, stood on. One night, after a particularly long meeting with Maggie, I stood by the harbor watching the water lap at the rocks. The air was heavy with the scent of rain. Leela came up beside me, wrapped in her father's old jacket. "Do you think he'll win?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "He might try, but he's fighting ghosts he doesn't understand. This isn't just about money, Leela, it's about memory." She nodded, her face solemn in the fading light. And then she said something I didn't expect. "I want to testify, Mom. I want to tell the court who Dad really was, what Harborlight meant to this town." I looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and felt something warm and fierce bloom in my chest. Tom would have been proud. The first hearing was held in the town courthouse, the same one where Tom once renewed our marriage license. It felt poetic, almost cruel. Daniel arrived in a gray suit, polished and self-assured. When he saw me, he smiled faintly, as if we were old acquaintances sharing a private joke. But I wasn't afraid anymore, because sitting beside me was my daughter. The same girl who had once sold my life for her dreams, now fighting beside me to protect what was left of her father's. When I took the stand, I told the truth. I told them about Tom's life, his kindness, his quiet intelligence, his endless belief that small things mattered. I told them about Harborlight's purpose, the people it had helped. And then I handed over Tom's letter. Daniel's lawyer tried to object, but Maggie's voice cut through the courtroom like steel. "It's a direct statement of the deceased's intent. It stays." The judge read it in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. The ruling came 2 weeks later. Reed versus Marlowe estate dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't come after us again. Daniel Reed left town the next day. No goodbye, no apology, just a shadow fading into the fog. When the letter came from the court, I sat in the bookstore holding it in my hands as the rain tapped softly against the windows. Leela sat across from me, eyes bright. "We won," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "We endured, and that felt better than winning." That night I went down to the harbor alone. The air was cool and clean, the moon low over the water. I stood there for a long time, thinking about Tom, about how even after death he was still guiding us through the storms. "I kept it safe, love," I whispered, "just like you asked." The waves whispered back, soft and eternal. And for the first time since that call in the clinic months ago, I felt at peace, not because everything was fixed, but because everything that mattered had survived. It had been 3 weeks since the court ruling. You'd think peace would feel like sunshine, warm, steady, comforting, but for me it arrived like fog. Slow, quiet, careful. It moved in on soft feet, unsure if it was welcome. The bookstore was alive again. The scent of fresh paper and roasted coffee mingled in the air, and for the first time in years, people lingered not just to buy something, but to stay. Maggie's niece painted a mural across the back wall, a lighthouse, its beam cutting through storm clouds. Underneath it, in curling script, she wrote, "Home is the tide that always finds you." Tom would have liked that. Every morning, Leela and I opened the doors together. We brewed the coffee, flipped the open sign, and took turns greeting the first customers. She laughed more now. The guilt still lived behind her eyes, but it had softened, worn down by work, humility, and time. If this were a movie, that's where the credits would roll: mother and daughter redeemed, justice served, the end. But real life isn't kind enough to stop when you're ready for it too. Because one gray afternoon, a letter arrived. It was tucked in between the day's mail, bills, receipts, catalogs, but the handwriting on the envelope stopped me cold. It wasn't Tom's. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But there was something about it, the careful script, the old-fashioned fountain pen ink, that felt deliberate. The return address simply read, Cedar Hill, Massachusetts. I sat behind the counter, turning it over in my hands. Leela looked up from unpacking books. "Who's it from?" "I don't know," I murmured, "but it feels heavy." She raised an eyebrow. "Heavy? Not in weight," I said. "In meaning." When I opened it, a folded letter slipped out and a small, faded photograph. The letter read, "Mrs. Marlowe, you don't know me, but I knew your husband very well. My name is Clara James. I run a small home for foster children in Cedar Hill. Your husband helped us start it. For years, he sent anonymous donations through something called the Heartfelt Fund. He asked that his name never be mentioned. He said, good deeds only matter when they don't expect applause." Last month, we received a letter from his lawyer, Maggie Duval, informing us that Heartfelt Holdings has been formally restored. That means our funding resumes, but there's something you should see. Something he left for you, stored in our archives. He said you'd come one day and that you'd know what to do. If you can, please visit. It's about a promise he made and the one he couldn't keep. With gratitude, Clara. The photograph that fell out showed Tom, younger, maybe in his 40s, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a little boy holding a toy boat. My throat tightened. I had never seen that photo before. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the harbor lights flicker like distant thoughts. A part of me wanted to ignore the letter, to fold it neatly, tuck it in a drawer, and pretend the story was over. But curiosity has a pulse, and mine beat harder with every hour that passed. By morning, I'd made up my mind. "Leela," I said over breakfast, "we're taking a trip." She blinked. "Where?" "Massachusetts, Cedar Hill," she frowned. "That's 2 states away. What's there?" "Something your father left behind," I said softly, "and I think it's time we find out what it is." The drive took nearly 7 hours. We passed through pine forests and sleepy towns, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. Leela took the wheel while I sat beside her, the photograph in my lap. Every time I looked at it, 1,000 small questions crowded my mind. Who was the boy? Why hadn't Tom told me about this woman? And what promise had he broken? By late afternoon, we reached Cedar Hill, a small town nestled near the edge of the Atlantic, full of white fences and weathered houses. The air smelled of lilac and rain. The home wasn't what I expected. It wasn't an institution. It was a big, old Victorian house with peeling paint and a garden full of toys. A faded sign near the gate read, "The Lighthouse Children's Home." A woman stood waiting on the porch. "You must be Mrs. Marlowe," she said warmly, shaking my hand. "And this must be Leela." She led us inside, to a cozy room filled with books and drawings taped to the walls. Children's laughter drifted down the hallway. "Tom used to visit, you know," Clara said, pouring us tea. "Not often, but when he did, the children adored him. He'd bring boxes of books and spend hours reading to them. He said stories were how lost children learn to belong again." My eyes burned. "That sounds like him," she smiled sadly. "He made us promise never to tell you, said you worried too much already." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "That sounds like him too." Then she grew serious. "Before he passed, he sent us a sealed box with your name on it. He said it should only be opened if you came yourself." She disappeared into another room and returned with a small wooden chest. My name, Evelyn, was carved delicately on the top. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of letters, and beneath them, another photograph. This time it was of the same boy, older now, maybe 12. Holding a certificate, Tom stood beside him again, pride shining in his eyes. The first letter on top was addressed to me. My Evie, I told you once that Harbor Light was our safety net. That was true, but not the whole truth. The first time I created it wasn't for us. It was for them, the children who have no harbor at all. When I was working at the docks, I met a boy named Caleb. He was 12, no parents. Slept in the boathouse and stole bread from the bakery. I took him under my wing, taught him how to sand the floors, fix engines. I saw so much of Leela in him, that same spark. But when we tried to adopt him, the agency refused. They said we were too old, so I did what I could. I funded this home and promised Caleb that one day he'd have a chance to go to college. That was the promise I couldn't keep before I died. If you're reading this, it means there's still time. The trust holds a scholarship fund under his name. Please make sure he finds it. It's the one thing I can't do without you. Love always, Tom. I pressed the letter to my chest. For all the years I'd thought I knew every piece of my husband, there were still corners of his soul I'd never seen. He hadn't just built Harbor Light for us. He'd built it for them. Clara told me Caleb had aged out of the system years ago. He left when he was 18, she said. He still calls sometimes, works at a shipyard in Boston. I knew what I had to do. That evening, I sat down at Clara's old oak desk and wrote a letter. My handwriting shook, but the words came steady. Dear Caleb, my name is Evelyn Marlowe. You don't know me, but you knew my husband, Tom. He left something behind for you, a scholarship and a story. I think it's time we met. A week later he came, tall now, broad-shouldered, with that same quiet focus Tom used to have. When he stepped into the bookstore, I saw recognition in his eyes. You're Mrs. Marlowe, he said. Yes, I replied, smiling. And you must be Caleb. We sat for hours trading stories about Tom, about the lighthouse home, about life. Leela joined us eventually, listening with tears in her eyes. When I handed him the envelope Tom had prepared all those years ago, he stared at it for a long time. He never stopped believing in me, he said softly. No, I whispered. He never stopped believing in anyone. He left that day with tears in his eyes and a future in his hands. And when the door closed behind him, I stood there, watching the tide roll in through the shop window. Leela came up beside me, slipping her arm through mine. He's just like Dad, isn't he? I smiled. Maybe that's the point. Because I realized then, Tom's legacy wasn't the buildings or the money. It was the way he made people believe they could begin again. And maybe that was the truest harbor of all. That night, as the last customers left and the lights dimmed, I stood alone in the shop, surrounded by shelves and sea air and memory. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted. I felt guided. Tom had built Harbor Light to protect the lost. And now I understood he'd included me among them. Some mornings, when the harbor is quiet and the gulls are still sleeping on the docks, I wake before sunrise and listen. Not to the wind, not to the sea, but to the silence. That beautiful, humbling silence that comes after a storm has passed. The kind that doesn't need to announce peace, it just is. It's been 6 months since the day Caleb walked into my life carrying Tom's legacy in his hands. The bookstore is thriving. The mural of the lighthouse still watches over us, but we added one more line beneath the quote. Leela painted it herself in gold paint. To Tom Marlowe, who built harbors out of people. Every day, I see someone stand beneath it, read the words, and smile. We reopened the small cafe corner Tom had always wanted, coffee, pastries, and a wall where customers can leave notes for strangers. A kindness wall, we call it. Some messages are simple. You are stronger than you think. Others carry stories, apologies, tiny fragments of lives being mended. It's funny, I used to think justice was about setting things right. But now I know it's about creating something good from what went wrong. And that's what Harbor Light became, not just a business, but a pulse. Leela found her rhythm again. She's the one who runs the daily operations now. I watch her greet people with warmth, recommend novels, and comfort teenagers who remind her of her younger self, all lost somewhere between ambition and forgiveness. She still keeps her father's jacket hanging by the counter. When she slips it on, she looks older, steadier, as if Tom's calm lives in its seams. One night after closing, she said, "Mom, I finally understand what Dad meant when he called this place our heartbeat." I smiled. "He wasn't talking about the building." She nodded, eyes soft. "I know. She doesn't say sorry anymore. She doesn't have to. We both know she's spent every day since earning her forgiveness in the language of actions." Caleb calls once a week. He got into college, an engineering program in Boston. He says he wants to design ships one day. Boats that can survive any storm, he told me. I told him he already was one. Sometimes he visits, brings flowers for the shop, tells stories about the kids from the lighthouse home. "They still talk about him," he said once, his eyes bright. "Your husband. They say he taught them what kindness sounds like." I laughed through tears. He always had a voice for it. Last week, I finally went through Tom's old chest, the one I couldn't open until now. Inside, I found little things. His pocket watch, a dried sea daisy, receipts from road trips I'd forgotten we took. And at the very bottom, a sealed letter addressed to me again, written in that unmistakable looping hand. "My Evie, if you're reading this, then I guess I managed to stay one step ahead of you one last time. You were always better at loving than at letting go, and I know how much you hate endings. But don't think of this as one. You were my home long before we built one. Every beam, every book, every brick in that little shop carried your laughter. And even now, it carries you forward. If the tides have brought you here, it means you've done what I couldn't. You've kept Harbor Light alive. But I want you to promise me one more thing. When it's time, let it belong to someone else. Let it live beyond us. That's the only way things like this stay true. The ocean doesn't keep what it loves, it carries it. Yours always, Tom." I don't know how long I sat there holding that letter. Maybe an hour, maybe a lifetime. Eventually, I walked outside to the bluff that overlooked the sea. The wind was soft that evening, the kind that feels like a hand brushing your hair. I read his words again, then folded the paper neatly and placed it in my coat pocket close to my heart, where it had always belonged. Today, I'm writing this at the front counter. The morning light is spilling across the window, and the smell of salt is drifting in from the harbor. I can hear Leela laughing with a customer. Caleb just texted to say he passed his exams. And Maggie, bless her heart, retired last week, though she still stops by for free coffee and gossip. Life goes on, not the way it was, but the way it should be. Sometimes I still dream of Tom standing by the shoreline, hands in his pockets, watching the waves. In the dream, I walk toward him, and just before I reach him, he smiles and says, "You found it, Evie, you found home again." And when I wake, I realize I did. Home isn't a place. It's the people we choose to love, the promises we keep, and the ones we forgive ourselves for breaking. This morning, before the shop opened, I added one more note to the kindness wall. I didn't sign it, I just wrote, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without the pain. Keep your harbor open." Then I stepped outside and watched the sun lift over the water. The tide was rolling in, calm and sure. And as the first rays of light touched the sign above the door, Marlowe Books, Est. 1982, and still here, I smiled through tears. Because somehow, through storms and silence, we were still here, still standing, still home. This was the ocean between us, a story of loss, love, and finding home again. Subscribe now to stay with us as more stories unfold beneath the same endless sky.